Hey everyone, so welcome to our very first participant workshop series. Today we have a few presentations by Holly Winter, Nolan Hildebrand, and Késia Decoté on some graphic scores. Each presentation is pretty short, and there's going to be a short question period after each presentation. So I guess we can just dive straight into it. Um, why don't we get started with Holly? Are you ready?
Yep. Can you hear me okay? Is
Yeah.
everyone sweet? I just know earlier. It's awesome. So I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Give me a second. Um, for my PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Zoom, 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 share screen. PowerPoint, share. Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Whew. Okay. Good afternoon, morning, evening, everyone, from wherever you are. My name's Holly Winter, and I'm coming to you from the island of Tahumguk and the unceded territory of the Yupik, also known as Newfoundland and Labrador, St. John's specifically. And my talk is called Excessively Graphic, the Musical Vitality of Visual Expression. I'm just going to be talking a little bit about my views on the history and sort of how I use graphic notation in my work, and a little bit about the specifics of like what programs I use and things like that. Awesome. So first, who am I? I am a settler from Nova Scotia. I am a composer, clarinetist, improviser, philosophy buff, multi-potentialite, comic nerd, art kid, theater kid person. Why I mention this is this sort of varied background of mine that I bring to my work is very related to sort of how I view graphic work and using multidisciplinary stuff in my composing. So one of the things that really drew me to composing as opposed to other sort of avenues of being a musician was because I could use my background in visual art. I could use my background in playwriting. I could use my background in poetry. I could draw from my background in mythology. Anything that sort of sparked my curiosity, I could use in my creations. So that's sort of why I'm drawn to sort of this space and why it's so exciting. Okay, very, very excessively brief overview of graphic notation. So this is by no means exhaustive, but I just want to sort of set the groundwork a little bit. So how I view it, graphic notation is actually any attempt to represent sound visually, which includes what I'm going to call Western notation, which is the traditional sort of Eastern or Western European classical tradition of staffs, notes, whole notes, half notes, that sort of tradition. I'm going to call it Western notation instead of traditional notation, as it's sometimes called, because I'm a believer that we should decentralize this idea of the traditional and the Western being synonymous, because there's many traditional musical practices around the world. So when I say Western notation, I'm talking about the sort of European classical way of representing sound as visuals. And all of these stem from an attempt to sort of record musical ideas. But that way is a graphic way. So the differentiating between the two is not sort of stark for me anyways. But the term is usually associated with mid-20th century Western classical music, specifically sort of in the university realm. It's associated with aleatoric music, especially of John Cage is often associated with this movement, and rejecting the specificity and like the really rigidity of that Western notation. It's also developed in this time period as a way to deal with new ways of conceiving of sound. If you hear snoring, that's my dog. There's not just a human snoring in this room. He decided now to start snoring. Yeah, representing digital sounds, extended techniques start to become more in the forefront, and we needed a way to sort of represent that. Another sort of way I conceive of graphic notation is this concept of exact versus inexact forms of graphic notation. So for me, an exact form of graphic notation is when a composer uses a graphic symbol that has a very specific meaning. It's like this little squiggly line means that you circular bow at this speed and in this way. So it's sort of a little bit of a switch in for the specific notation, and maybe because there is not a standard way of representing that technique or something like that. So that I would call an exact form of graphic notation versus an inexact form where the composer might be leaving things intentionally ambiguous so that the bit more aleatoric, which I should define, which means sort of chance. It means that some element is not being predetermined by the composer, either through the fact that there's chance, rolling dice or something, or that the performer sort of brings their self into it. Another really great use of graphic scores is in education. So a lot of people have used it to help sort of bring music to younger kids who maybe don't read music yet, or to sort of draw the focus away from reading music and reading Western notation and more focus on listening and creative music making practices, which I think is a really cool way to start to integrate it. I've linked a YouTube video that sort of goes more in depth, but it's still pretty short, about sort of the history of graphic scores in the mid 20th century. All right, let's continue. So one of the two things I really want to talk about is like, what does graphic notation communicate that Western notation can't or is not so good at? So one of the things that sort of propelled Western notation to become the way it is because it's very, very, very focused on pitch and rhythm or duration. So it's very good at communicating what note, at least within equal temperament, what note to play and how long to play it and when to play it. Super good at that, I will admit. Amazing. Things it is not so good at conveying emotions or like the vibe of the piece. Usually that's just gets delegated to like one word at the beginning of the piece of like dolce, and that's supposed to do all the heavy lifting of what like the emotional content of the piece is supposed to be. Slow, subtle changes of context are not really easily communicated. Intention of gesture, sometimes you can like write it all out, but there's no way to put that like this is a sigh gesture, for example, or something like that without sort of writing it out in text. Timbre or tone is not really well communicated. Relative duration and proportion. So something like this, I would think like, if you have a page of all 30-second notes, like 2 seconds is a whole page of music, versus if you're using quarter notes, you can represent like a lot more durational time. So they're not really related. So the space you're looking at is not related to the amount of time it's taking up in the Western notation system. Graphic notation can solve some of these problems. And then representation of electronic elements. So there's not a standard way of representing like a synth squiggle, you know? So these can be a really great way to sort of add an electronics part in your score for musicians to follow along. Another thing I wanted to mention, Western notation requires a lot of education for people to be able to understand it. You need a certain amount of training, and in certain circles that training can be presupposed, right? Like if we're in a Western classical university setting, you can pretty much assume that every student there will have a working knowledge of Western notation. But it is a very big barrier if you're looking to collaborate across cultures, to cultures whose musical practices might not involve teaching any sort of visual or this type of visual representation of music. So, woo. Oh no. Okay, so I'm just gonna give some examples from my work of how some of this sort of plays out. So this page is from a cello piece I wrote last summer called Song of Sekhmet. It's the second movement of solo cello. So what I wanna convey here is how this background that I've added to the score, although it doesn't add anything specifically musically, like it's not a note, it's not a rhythm, it's not sort of adding to any of that, I could have easily left it out. It is conveying something about sort of the vibe and the feel I wanted for this movement. That this movement is very aggressive, very angry, very violent, and that I felt was best conveyed by having this graphic element in the background rather than just putting the name Slaughter and just normal text and then letting the background be white. So that is one way that you can use graphics to help convey a vibe. This is another page from a piece I did for horn, solo horn and electronics. So here you can see graphic elements and Western elements sort of being combined together. But here I just wanted to point out how you can portray something. This is a siren sound that sort of happens through the whole, for a large portion of this. So I was just able to sort of have this squiggly line, and that's a cue that, oh, the siren's happening or these bird sounds are happening, to the performer to help them sort of stay on track with the electronics part. Similarly here. And then we also have some background vibe stuff going on. Vibe meaning like emotion. And then here we also have a bit more of like proportional durational way of representing the length of the note. So I'm using Western notation to convey pitch here, but the length is becoming graphic so that you can sort of visually see how much time it takes up. In a sort of a different way. And then this one is about more of the intention of the gesture. So this is from a most recent piece that's being premiered at the end of the month called Imposter. And it's all about my imposter syndrome. And so here the players are speaking and making these like unpitched sounds on their instruments. And then the red gestures are really violent attacks. And I thought that this sort of red, almost blood splatter like gesture got at the intention of the gesture more than I could ever write it out. So I much prefer for the musicians to see to respond to that red than write out like Bartok pits or something. I felt like it would get at the feel I wanted faster than trying to write it out and then communicate it and all that jazz. Okay, we're almost there. And then the other thing I want to talk about is that why I love graphic notation and this type of work is that it is inherently, that's not a word, but that's okay, collaborative. So every piece of music has built-in collaboration, even if you have very sort of Western traditional, there's the composer who writes the music in Western notation, and then there's the performers who perform the music, and they're trying to be as diligent about performing it exactly the way it's written. There's little variations in interpretation. There has to be. That's why we have like, oh, I love so-and-so's recording of so-and-so piece more than so-and-so's, because there's a difference, right? We can't get away from that. There's no way of controlling for like absolute, unless you only write computer music. So complete control by the composer is never possible. So what I like about graphic scores is that it accepts this and intentionally blurs the line between composer and performer by keeping some elements sort of up to interpretation, or many elements depending. We're inviting, as composers, we're inviting the performer to sort of participate in the compositional process. And it sort of makes, I feel at least, that my music is both the performers and my own. It's not just mine. It's not just theirs. It's something we've created together, and every performance is sort of a new creating together. I think a lot of people have a little bit of trouble with that, or some people, because our culture is really obsessed with this idea of ownership, especially of art, of like, I did that, it's mine, that's my art, and you must be true to my vision of the art because I am the artist, which for me, I don't think is very productive in a collaborative workspace or in my creative process, because the art is independent of me. I sort of give this element to it, but everyone else participating in the art is also giving different elements, and together we create it, which I think is really exciting. The last piece I'll talk about in terms of my work is called Nothing to Do with Explosions. And I think this is the most graphic I've gone personally in terms of like letting the performers have their own say. So what I did with this piece is it was for Hatch last year, which is part of Continuum's sort of emerging composer program. And what was really interesting about Hatch last year was that it was all online. COVID, we all know, we're all online. And we had to write a piece for 6 musicians that will never play together. Like they cannot be in the same room. They described it as a click track piece. None of the composers wrote a click track piece. We all decided to come up with creative solutions. So my creative solution was to create an electronics track that they would all play to, and this graphic score. So everyone is listening to the electronics, but not each other. And then I put together the final mix. So everything is graphic. I make no reference to like dynamics, forte piano, nothing like that. It's all just like squiggly lines, words, and textures. The only thing that's sort of familiar is this grid, which is more of a time grid to keep you with the electronics, which were represented at the bottom. And then what I was really drawn to is having the musicians interpret the color journey of this piece. So this piece moves from like a dark green through a lighter green to red to yellow, purple, white, blue, and then dark blue, and then eventually black. And my instructions were that you need to chart that journey timbrally on your instrument. I didn't tell them how. I just said, maybe you could do this and then move to this, pitched to unpitched, wood sounds to metal sounds. I don't really care how you do it. It's just that I want you to sort of go on that color journey with the score. So that's why the background in this particular one is really important. But the final product was so cool and so satisfying and so interesting. And I got to hear it and be surprised by it when I first heard it, and it was so brilliant. And every performance will be different, so I think that's really exciting. And it was really fun, very collaborative process. Yeah. And then really quickly, some things about things I use. So my process, in terms of creative process, I do a lot of research. I spend a lot of time finding a narrative or thematic idea for the piece. And then I spent a lot of time with physical medium doing sketches and just deciding what the form will look like. And all of that is graphic, even if I end up landing on a piece that's going to be more Westernly notated. I like using the graphic as a sort of brainstorm. And then I use many programs, as you can see. Traditional medium, Sibelius is my go-to, but they all suck and are good at the same time. Procreate, I use Microsoft Word a surprising amount. Logic Pro X is my DAW, and then I have a Blue Yeti mic. But the big takeaway here is that everyone has different tools they're comfortable with, but if you're looking to do this sort of process, you should design your art should come first. That's why I love using graphic scores and drawing with a pencil on a paper, because you can sort of plan it out without having whatever program you're using, whether it's a notation program or drawing program, the capabilities of that program are not informing your work. Because you see a lot of younger sort of artists and composers writing for the programs instead of sort of thinking, what is possible? This is what I want to do. Now I'm going to try and figure out the tools I need to do it. If that makes sense. Woo, okay, and that's it. Thank you, merci. I appreciate all your attention, and if you have any questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I really like to work in color too with my graphic notation, and I was wondering if you've ever had issues with printing or anything like that. I know my advisor's given me lots of flack for using color, so I'm just wondering what your take is on some of that.
That's a great question, and I was that was in the back of my mind. I think it's way more accessible now because a lot, especially of new music musicians, are playing off of iPads, and I think that's going to be taking over. So it is a lot more accessible. But I just went through writing a piece for the Electric Chamber Orchestra, and they were like, "We're gonna print them on paper." So I was like, "Okay." Knowing that ahead of time, I sort of printed in black and white and make sure that all of the important information is still communicated the way I want it to, and then they could reference the score on their computers to be like, "Oh, that's red," but that if in black and white, it's still legible, which is what for that one I didn't do these big like black and white or like dark blue backgrounds and things like that. But yeah, I think that's just, you have to sort of know who you're writing for and ask. But I think it'll become more and more accessible as technology takes over.
Totally, thanks.
Oh, there's things in the chat.
I actually have a question. Yes, so this was an awesome presentation. Thank you so much. So personally, I'm very much an amateur when it comes to reading and improvising off of graphic scores.
Mhm.
And so I guess I have this like barrier in my mind that if I want to like improv off of a graphic score, I'm like, am I doing this wrong? Like, am I actually like giving the score justice? I'm wondering if you have any tips for interpreters and performers for maybe getting over that.
Yeah, that's tough. And I think part of that is it's especially if we're trained in the Western classical tradition, this like we must do well by the score is ingrained into our souls. It's like all we practice is like, are those 16th notes even? Is so it's very hard to get over. And I had the same thing. That but you just have to sort of like trust and let go. If the composer cared, they would have put it in the front matter. So if there's nothing that says that this has to be interpreted this way or this, it is up to you. And you just sort of have to be like, I got this. I am a musician. My musical ideas are also valid. And like just go for it. And the more you do it, the more comfortable it becomes. But it is difficult. You're right.
Thank you.
Great questions.
I have a question. Thank you so much for the presentation. I also am so drawn to graphic scores, totally love them, but I do not have an artistic thing in my right hand. Like I cannot draw to save my life. So I'm wondering if you've ever collaborated with visual artists to or of people who do that in kind of working together to kind of translate the musical ideas, and another person who is capable of doing an elegant swish, and sort of collaborating to build a score that way for those of us who cannot draw.
Well, the first thing I will say is that we can learn to do anything, and you probably have way more skills than you think, and you should give it a try. But to your actual question, I think that would be really exciting. I haven't actually done that much myself, but I am working on a sort of collaboration with a filmmaker animator right now, where I'm providing sort of the musical elements and she's providing the visual elements, which is interesting for me because I'm usually the visual element person. So I think that, if that's something you're interested in and you want to find an animator or a illustrator who's into sound but doesn't know anything about it, and you're a sound person who's into sound and doesn't know much about visual art, that could be a really fruitful collaboration. You just gotta find someone and ask them. I think it'd be cool.
Okay, great, wonderful. If there's no more questions, why don't we move on to Nolan? Are you ready?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just gonna share my screen and then share computer sound. I think it should be good. One sec. Can everyone see this? Yeah? Okay, great. Okay. Okay. I can't hear anything, so just anyone let me know if I can't see anything, so anyone let me know if my internet connection is bad or anything like that. Okay, so my presentation today is entitled Graphic Notation as Practice-Based Research. And these are two very great graphic scores I like a lot. This one on top is a piece from Cornelius Cardew's treatise, and the portrait one on the right is Styx by Anastis Logothetis. So why graphic notation? Holly did a great job explaining a bit of the background and history of everything, so I'm just going to jump right into how I use it and how it kind of manifests in my own practice. So the first things that attracted me to graphic notation, not surprisingly, are the aesthetics of the scores. Those last two I think look fantastic. I think this one looks fantastic. I've have a background in visual arts as well, and yeah, just love the way it looks. And that brought in this kind of interdisciplinary practice where I can combine my musical artistic practice with my own visual artistic practice. And I really like making handmade scores like the ones I've shown so far, and I've began to incorporate these handwritten graphics into computer notation and software generated scores as well. Accessibility is another thing I'm interested in. When first encountering Cardew's treatise score from the previous page, I was very inspired by his philosophies on musical accessibility and his desire for graphic scores to be played by musical innocents and non-musicians. And I'm also really interested in the identity of of graphic scores, and I love that graphic notation can possess a potentially infinite number of correct interpretations. So some of the research questions that I'm looking to mostly revolve around these last 2 points. So the first being, how can graphic notation be used to create collaboration between disparate communities and artistic practices? So like Cardew, I'm interested in creating graphic scores that can be interpreted by people who have not been educated in Western music theory, people who are non-musicians, and people from different artistic backgrounds. These interpretations can illustrate graphic notation's accessibility and foster meaningful collaborations. And my second research question revolves around identity, and that is how, if at all, can open graphic scores retain any perceptible musical identity over subsequent performances? In an article by Virginia Anderson entitled The Beginning of Happiness, Approaching Scores in Graphic and Text Notation, she successfully illustrates how a piece by Earl Brown can retain a distinct identity over subsequent performances, but more convoluted open graphic scores like the one in this picture um, offer a potentially infinite number of correct interpretations. So this piece here is this is the cover from Mark Applebaum's 2008 score, The Metaphysics of Notation. Yeah, so those are my 2 main research questions. And with that, I'm going to talk about it in my own work and listen to it a bit too. So yeah, this first piece that I'm going to talk about is called Portals. This was my first successful graphic score and was initially written for a percussion and oboe reading session, and was recently expanded to be a more open instrumentation. The score with the cells over here is played by any type and number of reed instruments, and the second more open score, originally written for percussion, can now be played by any instrument. And while the first score does require the ability to read Western music notation with the staves and the notes and the dynamics and all those things, the second score, the one that was originally for percussion, is a good example of a graphic score that seeks to be more accessible for performers. The openness of the score also poses the question of a perceptible musical identity. So I'm going to try to listen to a short interpretation that happened in that reading session. Just let me know if the sound isn't working. So here we go. Sorry, I paused it there for a second. My mistake. Okay, moving on to the next piece. Oh dear, it's playing again. There we go. Cool. So this next piece was written during a composition and improvisation workshop in Winnipeg, Manitoba. This is it was called Brandenburg, and it's written for piano, bass clarinet, drum kit with processed cymbal, and live electronics. This piece is another good example of a graphic score that confronts my research questions on performer accessibility by not demanding the ability to strictly read music notation, although it does contain stabs and things like that, but it's pretty open. However, it is less ideal example for illustrating a perceptible musical identity because the piece is a bit more prescriptive and less open than the previous score. So I'll try to play this one. Cool. Okay. So just going to talk about two more pieces here. Not going to listen to any more excerpts. Just going to quickly listen, or sorry, quickly talk and show. So this piece was written. It's called "The Sky Is Opening," and it's written for drum kit with electroacoustic media, and was composed for the 1-2-1 workshop. Although The Sky Is Opening uses some graphic notation for the percussionist, as you can see happening in measure one, starting in measure 134 there. It more so utilizes organ music or eye music for the electroacoustic staff in the piece. Instead of utilizing graphic notation for the tape track in a Stockhausen-esque style, and I instead use a visual representation of the recorded sounds to illustrate the context and meaning of the piece. This work does not confront my main research questions, but creating the score on the computer instead of by hand was a really formative experience that I'm working on more, and really enjoying it. And then lastly, just a bad scan of one of my most recent graphic scores for my current research project. So I'm in the process of creating as many open graphic scores as I can to send to players for them to interpret. And ideally, I'm going to be able to build up a library of many interpretations of the same piece that I can use to further explore my main research questions. For my project, performers will be sent a questionnaire that will help to illuminate their musical decisions and to see how they do or do not correspond to the score. Asking performers to explain how the symbols translate into the sounds they make can offer one of the potentially many types of musical analysis that can be utilized in graphic notation. So what next? I want to complete this current project, and I'm also working over the summer as a research assistant using this oral sonology approach, which is this approach to analyzing music that was developed at the Norwegian Academy of Music. And I'm hoping to further just learn more about different types of analysis and the different ways that you can analyze graphic notation. And yeah, further synthesize my handwritten and computer created practices. And that's all. Thanks very much.
I have a question. Graphic score nerds unite. You mentioned one of your research top questions is about identity. Will it retain an identity? Does that? I'm curious about that and how that goes about. Is it have to do with sort of recognizability of like, could I say, oh, all of these were piece X because I can hear the similarities? Is that sort of what it's related to?
Yeah, that's definitely kind of the idea. Just exploring if that is a possibility with these super open graphics scores, because like you were mentioning too, and with that piece by Applebaum, like the documentary about that piece is called "There's No Sound in My Head," and he talks about how he wasn't hearing anything, and he sees all sorts of issues of authorship, and he sees the interpretations as the performers kind of as opposed to his. He was just kind of the vessel for their sonification. So yeah, I think it is about exploring that. And I mean, my initial thoughts are no. Like it'd be hard to hear multiple performings of a piece of treatise or something and say that yes, that's the same piece. It's hard, but I definitely want to explore it and see if there is any way to further research that stuff. Yeah, Matthew.
Hey, it's me. So I guess this is something that actually Jack's up on my screen. And so like Jack threw me some graphic stuff, and for me there was a moment where part of what was difficult with the stuff Jack did was it was like half notation, half not. But I want to talk specifically about the scan of the almost looked like Steve Ditko, like Doctor Strange, like a comic book sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, the fourth one, the most recent scan, yeah.
Sorry.
But no, it's okay. So what it is, how do you know when your piece has been played well? Is it just when you like it, or is it like, yeah, I could see how that would happen? Or how do you? What is the sort of is it the satisfaction in setting up a game that someone else can play?
Yeah, I think it's kind of just honestly any sort of musical engagement with the score providing the inspiration. I think it's really open when you're dealing with when you're dealing with those super open kind of concepts. I mean, I am definitely trying to illustrate kind of a process with that piece that is a little bit more instantly recognizable and hopefully a little bit more easily perceptible in the final sonification. But yeah, I think when you're working in such a open context, just any sort of engagement with the score in a musical way is an interpretation, and I'm hesitant to say whether, like I said, whether one's correct or one's good or anything like that.
Okay.
I think Jack had a question.
Sure.
Yeah, my question is actually directly related to the idea of engagement, and I want to open it up to both of you. Something I think about when it comes to graphic scores is sort of the potential of kind of actually like this like faux kind of bullshit engagement to exist, where especially maybe even with like really great improvisers where they're just kind of doing their own thing. Maybe in some ways the piece is sort of this catalyst, but in many other ways it's kind of what's coming is maybe more from their language than it is from what it is that the graphic score artwork does. And I guess maybe what do you think about like the different levels of engagement that can exist? And because there are different ways that you can engage, is that something that you should just let happen, or something that in some sort of extra musical process based way you should maybe actually exert a little bit more control or facilitate the process in some other way? So I'm opening that up to either of you to think about.
Yeah. I mean, off the top of my head, I think if whatever I want to have happen, if I want anything specific to have happen, I'll ask for it. And if I'm not going to ask for that, then it's I can't really yeah, I can't. I'm not asking for it, so it can potentially be whatever it is, and who am I to say whether that was yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sort of the same ilk as I often describe myself as an offhands composer. Because I often get questions of like, how do you want this to sound? And I'm like, I really want you to decide what it sounds like. And in my experience, musicians tend to err on the other side of like trying to get what you want more than you want them to try and get what you want, just because of how classical musicians are trained. But I think for me, this all ties back to this idea of ownership of this. If I feel like my piece needs to be played a certain way, I'm still feeling like it's mine and not this sort of collaborative process between me and whoever's playing it, even if I'm not in the room. So whatever people do with that visual thing once it's out there is all great. Even if they just look at the first color and then it's all different from there, then like, hey, man, that's cool. I don't really have a problem with it personally. And like Nolan said, if I do want something specific, like a vibe or a feel, I will be very explicit in that in the like score.
Okay, thank you for that presentation, Nolan. I think now last up we have Késia.
Hello, hi everyone. Can you hear me well? Cool, nice. So I'm Késia Decoté. I am a Brazilian pianist with musical homes in Brazil and in the UK, and with some visits to Canada. Love Canadian scene. So, and situation is, at the beginning of the pandemic last year, I was living in a studio flat, a very tiny apartment in Brasilia, so in the middle of Brazil. I had just moved there for a temporary job at the university. And then all of a sudden we had the pandemic, and then we entered in self-isolation. And then my universe was shrunk in that flat, in those 28 square meters. And then being there, I started exploring some short piano pieces, so piano miniatures. And that's very interesting. These are small pieces that comprise in less than 2 minutes, like whole universes. And okay, so once exploring playing, so how to present this repertoire? So we musicians start exploring digital formats. And I wanted to explore the possibilities that in real life I couldn't have in a concert. For example, showing different angles of myself as a pianist and exploring visuals. And so with these ideas in mind, I recorded my performance of some miniatures during a day. So really acknowledging the sound context of my life in that apartment and of my neighbors and of the instruments, and acknowledging the different lights of the passing of the day, and combining this with some images that I had from my daily life in that miniaturized universe, and really getting inspired by ideas from video art to share my music. So making a kind of musical and visual journal of that strange time. So I will show you what like the results of those explorations. That's the video recital. And among the music that I play, there are some miniatures composed by Charlotte Bauderill, some two composers based in the UK. And they wrote these pieces also during the period of self-isolation in the first months of the pandemic. So I'll share my screen to play for you. Piano Miniaturas.
O universo é muito grande para nós. A morte é muito grande para nós. A miniatura, então, é uma tentativa de reproduzir o universo. Em uma forma alcançável.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions? Okay, if not, thank you, Késia, Holly, and Nolan for the presentations. And thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you at the next workshop.
I see a couple little hand icons.
Oh, are there?
Well, they sort of flashed and then disappeared again.
That was the clapping emoji.
Oh, that's the clapping emoji. Looks a lot like the putting your hands up emoji.
It's confusing, yes.
Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.